My son gave me two choices: serve his fiancée or leave quietly. I smiled, grabbed my suitcase, and before we begin today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us keep creating. My name is Evelyn Hart, though everyone in town used to call me Evie. It's been a long while since anyone said it with the same tenderness my husband once did. I suppose time softens the edges of everything, even names. I live alone now, in a small apartment over on Maple Drive. The kind of place where the wallpaper curls a little at the corners and the air smells faintly of dust and lavender polish. But before I ended up here, I lived in a house that knew my footsteps like a heartbeat. That house, my son's house, was once my home, too. It started with a phone call on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that makes you believe in quiet miracles. Sunlight spilling through lace curtains, the hum of an old radio playing Patsy Cline. I was folding laundry when the phone rang, and I remember thinking it must be Mark, my boy, checking in like he used to. He hadn't called much since marrying Clara. She was polite in that glossy, practiced way some women are. A smile too perfect, a tone too sweet, like the kind of honey that's gone just a bit sour underneath. I never disliked her, not at first. I just never quite found where I fit once she arrived. When I answered, Mark's voice was low, careful. "Mom, we've been talking," he said, and already I could feel something trembling in the air between us. "Clara and I think it's time we set some boundaries." Boundaries. Such a clean, sharp word for something that cuts so deep. He went on to say that living with them, helping around the house, watching their little girl, Emma, had been a blessing, but things were different now. Clara was trying to create her own space, and they thought maybe it was time for me to transition. He said the word like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. Then came the two choices. I could stay, but under Clara's new arrangements, which meant cooking, cleaning, taking care of Emma, and helping with the household in a supportive role, as he put it. In simpler words, I could serve, or I could leave quietly. No fuss, no hurt feelings, just pack my things and go find somewhere else to belong. My heart didn't break all at once. It cracked quietly, like ice shifting underfoot. I remember standing there in the kitchen, the afternoon light brushing over the yellow tiles, and realizing that my son, the baby I once rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, had just given me a choice between servitude and solitude. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I looked around that familiar space. The smell of cinnamon from the jar I'd kept near the stove, plus the photo of his father on the counter, that little sound the old clock made every hour. And I smiled. "All right, sweetheart," I said softly. "I'll think about it." And I did think about it. All night. I thought about every lunchbox I packed, every birthday I baked for, every scraped knee I kissed. I thought about how he'd once told me I was his best friend. I thought about the day Clara first came home to meet me, wearing a blue dress that fluttered when she walked, and how she'd called me Mrs. Hart instead of Evie. By morning, my mind was as clear as the sunrise that spilled through my window. I packed my suitcase, the same one I'd brought to this country when I was 23 and full of hope. I folded my clothes neatly, the way my mother taught me, and tucked a single photograph inside. Mark at 8 years old, missing his two front teeth, holding a paper airplane and grinning at me like I hung the stars myself. When I zipped the suitcase shut, I felt a strange kind of peace. Mark was at work when I left. Clara stood by the doorway, arms crossed, her perfume too sweet for that early in the day. "You're really leaving?" she asked, half surprised, half relieved. I smiled again, the same smile I'd worn when my husband passed, when the world felt heavy, but I still had to stand. "Yes," I said, quietly. She didn't answer, just nodded, and I walked down that front path one last time, the same path where I'd once taught my son to ride a bike, where we'd planted marigolds that never quite grew straight. The air outside was cool and kind. My old car waited at the curb, sun glinting off the hood like a wink from heaven. I opened the door, slid in, and before turning the key, I whispered to myself, "All right, Evie, let's find out who you are without them." And that was the beginning, though at the time I thought it was the end. I drove without a plan, the road humming softly beneath my tires like an old lullaby. The morning sun was warm, painting the edges of the sky with gold, and the air carried that early spring smell, somewhere between rain and renewal. I passed neighborhoods that once knew my laughter, streets where I used to walk Mark to school with his little backpack bouncing against his shoulders. It felt strange, seeing the world move on without me, as if life had been quietly waiting for me to catch up. I didn't have much packed, just a few dresses, a sweater or two, my Bible, and that old photo of Mark. But I had something else too, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this was God's way of leading me somewhere I needed to go. Sometimes when the door closes too gently to slam, it's not rejection, it's redirection. By the time I reached the river that split the town in two, the sun had already begun to dip behind the hills. There was a small roadside motel there, the kind with faded green paint, a flickering vacancy sign, and a gravel lot that crunched under the weight of old memories. I'd passed it hundreds of times before, but never had a reason to stop. That night, it looked almost inviting. The woman behind the counter was in her late 50s, hair teased high and sprayed to perfection, wearing a pink cardigan that looked like it had been her favorite for years. Her name tag read Marge. "Evening, hon. You need a room?" she asked, voice warm, eyes soft but curious. "Yes," I said, resting my suitcase beside me. "Just for a few days, I think." She slid a key across the counter, an actual key, not one of those plastic cards. "Room 7. It's got a nice view of the river, if you don't mind the frogs singing at night." "I think I'd like that," I smiled. As I unlocked the door, a rush of old air met me, musty but gentle, like an attic full of stories. The wallpaper was peeling in one corner, and the bedspread had seen better days, but the lamp gave off a soft amber light that felt almost like home. I set my suitcase down, sat on the edge of the bed, and just breathed. It was quiet, too quiet, perhaps. No footsteps above me, no little girl calling grandma, no hum of a dishwasher or Clara's perfume clinging to the air. Just me and the faint gurgle of the river outside. I remember that first night vividly. I made myself a cup of instant coffee from the lobby and stood by the window, watching the moonlight ripple over the water. It reminded me of when Mark was a boy. We used to come down by this very river, skipping stones and talking about what he wanted to be when he grew up. "Maybe a pilot," he'd said once, "so I can take you anywhere you want to go, Mom." Some promises are made in innocence, and maybe that's why they sting so much when they're broken. I didn't cry that night, not properly. My tears came in quiet waves, the kind that leave no trace except the heaviness in your chest afterward. I whispered a prayer, not asking for anything really, just thanking God for keeping me steady when everything else felt uncertain. In the morning, I woke early, pulled on a sweater, and walked to the diner across the road, Maggie's place. It was the sort of spot where the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and the waitresses called everyone sweetheart. I ordered pancakes and watched people come and go. Construction workers, young couples, a woman with a baby balanced on her hip. That's when I realized something. The world doesn't stop spinning when your heart breaks. It just keeps going, quietly, mercifully. Over the next few days, I began to talk with Marge, the motel owner. She was a widow, too, had been for 10 years. She'd run the place with her husband before he passed. "He used to fix everything around here," she told me one afternoon, sitting behind the counter with a cigarette she never lit. "Now I just call Joe from down the road when something leaks. He charges too much, but he's polite." There was comfort in her simplicity, in her way of talking about loss without dressing it up in pity. We'd sit on the front steps in the evenings, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs, watching the sun set over the river. One evening, as the sky turned to that dusky purple that always made me homesick, Marge asked, "So what brings you to my little slice of heaven?" I hesitated. The truth felt heavy in my throat, but there was something about her, something maternal, understanding. "My son," I finally said. "He and his wife, they thought it was time I moved out." She nodded slowly like she'd already guessed. "Ah, the old 'we need space' talk." She chuckled, not unkindly. "Happens more than you'd think. Kids grow up, forget who fed them their first solid meal." Her words weren't bitter, just seasoned with life. "I don't blame him," I said softly. "He's trying to make a life of his own. I just wish he'd remembered that I gave up mine to help him build it." Marge patted my hand. "You'll find your footing again, Evie. Sometimes we don't lose ourselves, we just get put on pause for a while." That night, I lay awake thinking about her words. Put on pause. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of another one. A few days later, I found myself at the community bulletin board near the diner. Among the usual flyers for yard sales and missing cats, one little paper caught my eye. It read, "Help wanted, part-time caregiver for elderly woman, room and board included." There was a number written neatly in blue ink at the bottom. I stood there a long while holding that piece of paper, feeling something stir inside me, a mix of fear and hope. I'd spent so many years taking care of others. Maybe that's what I was meant to do again. Just somewhere new. When I called, a gentle voice answered, "Hello, this is Mrs. Dempsey." She sounded kind. Tired, but kind. We talked for nearly an hour. She told me about her mother, a sweet but stubborn woman named Margaret, who needed help with meals, light cleaning, and company. "She doesn't like strangers much," Mrs. Dempsey warned, "but she warms up once she realizes you're not here to steal her silverware." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. By the end of the call, we'd agreed I'd come by the next morning. When I hung up, I caught my reflection in the mirror by the bed. My hair was a little grayer than I remembered, my eyes a bit more tired, but there was a spark there, small, yes, but alive. The next morning, I drove out to the Dempsey farmhouse on the edge of town. It was an old place with a wraparound porch and a swing that creaked in the wind. Margaret Dempsey sat in a rocking chair, wrapped in a knitted shawl, watching the world like she'd seen too much of it already. "You must be Evelyn," she said as I approached. Her voice was sharp but not unkind. "You don't look like a thief." "Not lately," I smiled. She cracked the faintest grin, and just like that, the ice between us melted. Over the weeks that followed, the Dempsey house became a kind of refuge. Margaret was a handful, stubborn as a mule, set in her ways, but she had a wit that could cut glass. I learned her rhythms. Tea at 4, the radio tuned to her favorite gospel station, a nap after lunch. I cooked her meals, read her stories, and listened when she needed to talk about her husband. Gone 20 years now, but still the center of her world. "Love doesn't fade," she told me once, staring at his photo on the mantel. "It just changes shape. Sometimes it becomes a prayer instead of a presence." That line stayed with me. Working for Margaret gave my days structure, my heart purpose. There was something deeply healing about caring for someone again, but this time without being taken for granted. I began to feel like myself again, piece by piece. On Sundays, I'd still drive into town for coffee with Marge. She'd always ask, "How's your old lady doing?" And I'd say, "Still alive, still bossing me around." Then we'd laugh until our sides hurt. But even as life began to find its rhythm again, I couldn't stop thinking about Mark. I'd left without much of a goodbye, and though weeks had turned to months, I hadn't heard a word from him. Not a call, not a letter, not even a text. I tried to tell myself he was busy, that maybe he needed space to realize what he'd done. But late at night, the silence felt like a punishment I didn't deserve. Then, one Thursday morning, it happened. I was peeling apples for a pie when I heard my phone buzz on the counter. I wiped my hands on a towel and picked it up. The message was simple. "Mom, it's Mark. Can we talk?" My hands trembled as I typed back, "Of course, sweetheart. I'd like that very much." He called an hour later. His voice sounded uncertain, softer than before, the kind of tone you use when you're afraid to break something that's already cracked. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how I talked to you." I stayed quiet, letting him find his words. "I shouldn't have given you those choices," he continued. "Clara and we were under a lot of pressure, and you thought it would make things easier," I finished for him. He sighed. "Yeah, but it didn't. It just made me realize how much you did for us. Emma still asks about you every day." That last part, it undid me. I blinked away tears and said, "Tell her Grandma loves her, always." "I will," he promised. There was a pause. Would you consider coming by sometime, just for dinner?" I hesitated. My heart wanted to say yes, but something inside whispered caution. I'd rebuilt a fragile piece, and I wasn't ready to have it shattered again. "Maybe one day soon," I said gently. "But for now, I'm okay where I am." He understood. I could hear it in his quiet exhale. We talked for another 10 minutes about Emma's new school, his job, even Clara's attempt at baking bread. "Don't eat it, Mom, it's like a brick," he joked, and we both laughed. It felt almost normal again. Almost. After we hung up, I stepped outside to the porch. Margaret was napping, the afternoon light spilling across the wooden floorboards. I sat on the swing, closed my eyes, and let the breeze wrap around me. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to forgiveness. Not the kind that rushes in and wipes everything clean, but the kind that grows slowly, like a wildflower through cracks in the pavement. I realized then that leaving my son's house hadn't been an act of surrender. It was an act of love. For him, yes, but also for myself. Because sometimes stepping away is the only way to show them what they've lost and what you still have to give. That night, I pulled out that old photograph of Mark again. I looked at his gap-toothed smile, the innocence of it, and I whispered, "You're still my boy." The river sang outside, soft and steady, and for the first time since I'd left, I didn't feel like a woman without a home. I felt like a woman who'd found her way back to herself. The summer came slowly that year, the kind of slow that makes you notice things you used to overlook. The first lilacs by the porch, the way light danced across the floorboards at noon, the distant hum of bees in the garden. Margaret called it God's quiet hour, when the world softened just enough for old hearts to rest. I'd been living at the Dempsey house for nearly 3 months by then. My days had fallen into an easy rhythm. Mornings spent cooking oatmeal and watering the geraniums, afternoons reading aloud to Margaret or sitting with her as she dozed by the window. In the evenings, I'd walk down the gravel path behind the house, watching the sun melt into the horizon like honey on warm bread. It wasn't a glamorous life, no grand gestures or dramatic turns. But there was peace in its simplicity. After years of giving myself away in little pieces, I'd finally found a place where I was seen, not used. Margaret could be difficult, of course. She was 88 and prided herself on being as sharp as a tack, which meant she noticed every speck of dust, every misfolded napkin, every little thing out of place. But she was also fiercely loyal. Once she let you in, she guarded you like a lioness. One morning, while I was making her tea, she asked out of the blue, "So, Evelyn, why'd your boy send you packing?" I almost spilled the sugar bowl. "You don't waste time getting to the point, do you?" I said, trying to sound light. She shrugged. "No point dancing around it. You got that ache in your eyes, the one women get when love's been mistaken for a burden." Her words landed somewhere deep inside me. I set the teacup in front of her and sat down. "He didn't mean to hurt me," I said quietly. "He just forgot that. I wasn't done being his mother." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "My eldest did the same thing. Moved his wife in, told me to stay out of the way. I packed my things and went to Florida for 10 years. Spent every day walking the beach, feeding seagulls. You know what happened?" "What?" "He called me one Christmas, cried like a child, said he missed me. I told him I missed me too." She laughed, a dry, amused sound, but not bitter. "Sometimes you have to remind them you're not a fixture, you're a person." That was Margaret, blunt as truth, but with kindness hiding underneath. Her daughter Helen came by every weekend bringing groceries and updates from town. She was a nurse, all business and neat ponytails. She appreciated me more than she said, I think. One Saturday afternoon as she was leaving, she pressed a folded check into my hand. "For the extra hours," she said. I tried to hand it back. "Oh, no, Helen, please. I'm just happy to help." She smiled faintly. "You remind me of my mom's sister. Always putting everyone else first. Please, take it. Buy yourself something nice." After she left, I slipped the check into my Bible, not for the money, but for what it meant, that someone saw my worth again. A few days later, something unexpected happened. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was on the porch, hanging laundry when a car pulled up. A silver Honda, newer model, clean, the kind of car young families drive. I thought it might be Helen, but when the door opened, my breath caught. It was Clara. She stepped out slowly, dressed in a pale yellow sundress, sunglasses perched on her head. She looked nervous, almost fragile, not the polished woman who once ruled my son's household with quiet authority. "Mrs. Hart," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to betray whatever courage had brought her here. I froze for a moment. "Clara," I managed finally, "this is a surprise." She clasped her hands, looking everywhere but at me. "Mark told me where you were. I hope that's okay." I nodded, still wary. "It's fine. Would you like to sit?" We sat on the porch steps, the scent of lilacs thick in the air. She kept glancing at the clothesline, the simple white sheets fluttering like quiet ghosts, as if trying to find her words in their motion. Mark and I have been having a hard time, she said after a long pause. Since you left. I waited, unsure what to say. She went on, her voice breaking in places. It's like the house got colder. I didn't realize how much of the warmth came from you. You made everything feel. She stopped, swallowing hard. I thought I wanted space, but it turns out what I wanted was control, and that's not the same thing. Her honesty surprised me. People make mistakes, I said gently. We all do. She nodded, tears welling up. I was jealous, Evelyn, of how close you and Mark were. It made me feel small, like I'd always be standing in your shadow. I thought if I could push you out, maybe I'd finally feel like the center of his world. I sighed, feeling both the ache and the mercy of her confession. Oh, Clara, I never wanted to take anything from you. I just wanted to be part of the world my son built. She finally looked at me then, really looked. I know, I see that now. For a while, we just sat there in silence, listening to the wind through the trees. I'm sorry, she said at last, for everything, for the way I treated you, for making Mark choose. I reached out and touched her hand, the gesture as instinctive as breathing. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. Then she did something I never expected. She hugged me. It was awkward at first, uncertain, but it lingered long enough to feel real. When she pulled away, her eyes were red, but lighter somehow. Emma misses you, she said softly. She talks about you every night before bed. Would you come see her? I hesitated. My heart leapt at the thought, but fear, that quiet, cautious fear of being hurt again, tugged at the edges. I'll think about it, I said carefully. Clara nodded as if she understood. That's all I ask. After she left, I sat there for a long time, the air still carrying the scent of her perfume. I should have felt vindicated, maybe even satisfied. But what I felt was something gentler, a kind of release. Margaret came out not long after, leaning on her cane. That your daughter-in-law? Yes, I said softly. She came to apologize. Margaret snorted. Took her long enough. Still, good for her. Pride's a hard thing to swallow. She lowered herself into the chair beside me, eyes twinkling. You gonna forgive her? I think I already did, I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. That evening, as I made dinner, I hummed, without realizing it, an old tune from my childhood. The kitchen smelled of baked chicken and rosemary, and the setting sun poured through the window like a blessing. For the first time since leaving my son's house, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I felt like I was walking toward something better. A few weeks passed. Life settled into its gentle rhythm again. But now there was a lightness in me that hadn't been there before. Sometimes healing doesn't come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's just the quiet decision to let go of what you can't change. Then one Sunday, as I was leaving church, I heard a familiar little voice call out, "Grandma!" I turned, and there she was, Emma, running toward me with her curls bouncing, arms outstretched. Behind her, Mark stood near the car, smiling hesitantly. Before I knew it, she was in my arms, giggling, babbling about her new bike, her school friends, the cookies she baked with her mom. I held her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, that sweet innocence that makes time stand still. Mark approached slowly. Hope you don't mind, he said. Clara thought maybe this would be good. I looked at him, really looked. And for the first time, I saw not the boy who'd hurt me, but the man who was trying to make it right. I don't mind, I said, my voice thick. I don't mind at all. We spent that afternoon by the park near the river. Mark and Clara brought sandwiches, and Emma insisted we feed the ducks. It felt strange at first, tentative, careful, but then, little by little, laughter began to bridge the gaps between us. At one point, Clara sat beside me and whispered, "Thank you for coming." I smiled. "Thank you for asking." As the sun began to set, Emma climbed into my lap and whispered, "Grandma, can you come back home?" I kissed her forehead. "Sweetheart, Grandma has a home now, but I'll visit, I promise." Mark reached over then, resting his hand on mine. "You'll always have a place with us, Mom, always." And somehow I believed him. That night when I returned to the Dempsey house, Margaret was waiting by the window. "Well?" she asked. I smiled. It was good. Better than I expected. She nodded knowingly. "Told you. God don't waste pain, Evelyn. He turns it into wisdom." I laughed softly. "You should write that down." "Already did," she said, pointing to the worn Bible on her lap, "somewhere between Psalms and my grocery list." We both chuckled, and I realized how far I'd come from that morning I'd left with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. I'd thought I was walking away from love, but in truth, I was walking toward a deeper one. The kind that forgives, that understands, that lets go without bitterness. Later that night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching fireflies flicker across the field. The world was quiet, but not lonely. I thought of Mark, of Clara, of little Emma, and of how sometimes distance doesn't destroy love. It clarifies it. I didn't know what the future held, or whether things would ever be quite the same, but I knew this. I had survived the letting go, and in doing so, I'd found myself again. And maybe, just maybe, that was the miracle I'd been waiting for all along. The year had begun to turn again, the sharp heat of summer slipping into the softer golds of autumn. I'd always loved that change. How the air smelled of wood smoke and endings, how the leaves let go without regret. It reminded me that even beauty knows when to bow out gracefully. At the Dempsey house, the rhythm of life slowed in small ways. Margaret wasn't quite as quick on her feet anymore. Some mornings she'd wake disoriented, calling for her husband or forgetting what day it was. Other times, she'd be sharp as ever, scolding me for letting the kettle whistle too long or for overcooking her oatmeal. "Don't you dare treat me like glass," she warned one day, wagging her spoon at me. "I might be cracking, but I'm not broken." I smiled, though my heart ached. "Yes, ma'am," I said, pretending to fuss over the flowers instead of the tears that had crept into my eyes. Her daughter Helen began visiting more often. We'd sit together on the porch, comparing notes, quietly dancing around the truth we both knew but didn't want to name, that Margaret's time was winding down. One afternoon after Helen had gone, I found Margaret dozing in her chair by the window. Her Bible lay open on her lap, a pressed flower marking a page. I lifted it gently, and there, tucked inside the fold, was a photograph, black and white, edges curled, showing a young couple smiling beside a car. "She was something, wasn't she?" Margaret murmured without opening her eyes. "She was beautiful," I said softly, realizing the woman in the picture was her, radiant and free, the kind of joy that only comes from first love. "That was 1953, she whispered. "He just proposed. Said he'd love me till the stars forgot how to shine." I smiled. "Did he keep his word?" Her lips trembled into a smile. "Every day." That night I sat on the porch alone, thinking about love, the kind that endures, the kind that changes shape but never disappears. I thought about my husband, gone now 21 years, and how he used to leave notes in the kitchen for me. "You're my morning reason." Simple, silly words that carried more warmth than any poem. I hadn't thought of him in a long while, not really. I'd kept myself too busy mothering, helping, holding. But lately his memory felt closer, like he'd been walking beside me quietly, waiting for me to notice. A few days later, I received a call from Mark. His voice was tense. "Mom, I don't know who else to call. Clara's been sick, nothing serious. The doctor says it's stress, but she's worn out. And Emma, well, she keeps asking for you." There was a pause, the kind that fills with more emotion than words can carry. "I don't want to ask," he said finally, "after everything. But could you come stay for a bit?" I didn't hesitate. "Of course, sweetheart, I'll be there tomorrow." When I told Margaret, she gave a weak but approving nod. "Go," she said. "Your family needs you." "But what about you?" She smiled faintly. "I've had 88 years of being cared for. I can manage a few days of quiet." I promised Helen I'd call daily, then packed my small suitcase once again. It struck me how the same case that had carried me away from my son's home months ago was now carrying me back to it. Life has a sense of humor that way. The drive felt both familiar and foreign. The trees lining the road were aflame with color. Reds and oranges so vivid, they almost hurt to look at. When I pulled into the old driveway, my heart caught. The house looked the same, the white porch, the marigolds, now finally blooming, the sound of the wind chime. I'd hung years ago, still singing at the door. Clara came out first. Her face was pale, tired, but her smile was real. "Evelyn," she said softly, opening her arms. This time I didn't hesitate. Inside, the house smelled of chamomile and lemon polish. Comforting, familiar. Emma ran to me, clutching a stuffed bear. "Grandma, Daddy made pancakes, but they were flat," Mark chuckled sheepishly, "still working on my culinary skills." For a few days, I fell into the gentle rhythm of the home again. I cooked, helped with Emma's school things, and sat with Clara in the evenings when Mark worked late. She confessed that she'd been struggling with anxiety, with the weight of being everything to everyone. I understood that all too well. "You don't have to be everything," I told her one night as we sipped tea. "You just have to be here. The rest is grace." She nodded, tears glinting. I wish I'd known that before. There was no bitterness left between us, only understanding. Sometimes distance teaches love how to breathe again. One morning I stepped into what used to be my room, now a guest room, and found a box on the dresser. On top was a note in Mark's handwriting. "Mom, found this while cleaning the attic. Thought you might want it." Inside were old letters, yellowed with time, tied together with a ribbon. My heart stopped. It was my handwriting. Letters I had written to my husband, but never mailed. I sat on the bed, untied the ribbon, and began to read. The first was dated June 1984. "My love, I miss you tonight more than I can bear. Mark lost his first tooth, and I tried to make it a celebration, but it wasn't the same without you here to laugh with us. I keep waiting for the sound of your truck in the driveway, the slam of the door, your boots on the floor. I pretend sometimes just to feel close." Another read. "It's strange, raising a boy without the man who taught me how to love gently. I hope I'm doing right by him. Some days I think I see you in the way he frowns when he's thinking, and I tell myself that means you're still here somehow." By the time I reached the last letter, my tears had soaked the pages. It was dated only a week before he'd passed. "If love had a scent, it would be your shirt after a long day. If it had a sound, it would be your laughter through these old walls. And if it had a home, it would be right here, in this heart that will never stop waiting for you." I pressed the paper to my chest and whispered, "You kept your word, didn't you?" Mark found me like that a few minutes later. "Mom?" I smiled through the tears, just remembering. He sat beside me, his hand covering mine. "I didn't know these existed." "I didn't either," I said softly. "Sometimes love hides until you're ready to see it again." We sat there a long while, saying nothing. It was enough just to be still together, to feel the quiet bridge between past and present. Later that evening, as I tucked Emma into bed, she asked, "Grandma, do people go to heaven when they get old?" I thought about Margaret, about her fragile hands and her fading voice. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, "they do, and they watch over the ones they love until it's their turn." She smiled sleepily. "Then maybe Grandpa watches over you." I kissed her forehead. "I think he does." 2 days later, Helen called. Her voice was gentle but strained. "Evelyn, Mom took a turn. She's resting, but if you want to see her, you should come soon." I packed quietly that night. Clara offered to drive me, but I told her I needed to go alone. When I arrived, the house was still. Margaret lay in her bed, her skin pale but peaceful. She opened her eyes as I entered and smiled faintly. "There you are," she whispered. "Did they treat you well?" "They did," I said, taking her hand. "You were right. Love doesn't fade," she chuckled weakly. "Told you so." We talked for a while, mostly about nothing. The weather, the garden, the sound of the crickets outside. Finally, she squeezed my hand and said, "Promise me something. Anything. Keep loving, even when it hurts. That's the only thing that makes it all worth it." I nodded, tears blurring my vision. "I promise." She smiled one last time and whispered, "Good girl." When she passed that night, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a door softly closing. Helen and I handled the arrangements together. There was grief, yes, but also gratitude. Margaret had lived fully, loved deeply, and left gently, the way I think most of us hope to go. After the funeral, I stood by the river that ran behind her house, watching the leaves float downstream. I thought of all the women like her, strong, imperfect, loving, and flawed, who'd shaped me, and how their stories lived on in the hearts they'd touched. When I returned to my little apartment weeks later, it no longer felt empty. On my desk sat a single photograph, Margaret in her rocking chair, sunlight on her face, beside my husband's old pocket watch, long stopped but still gleaming. I took out a notebook and began to write. Not letters this time, stories. My stories. The ones I'd carried for too long without giving them breath, about love and loss and the courage it takes to start again. Each night I'd write until the moonlight faded. And sometimes when the words flowed just right, I'd swear I could hear Margaret's voice in the back of my mind saying, "That's it, Evie, tell it true." One evening, as I finished a page, the phone rang. It was Mark. Mom, he said softly, Emma's school is doing a family storytelling night. Would you come tell one of your stories? I smiled. I'd like that very much. And that's how, months later, I stood in front of a small crowd of children and parents, my granddaughter in the front row, her eyes wide with pride. I read a story about a woman who lost everything she thought she was and found everything she truly needed. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then the applause began. Emma ran up, hugging my waist. That was you, wasn't it, Grandma? I bent down and whispered, maybe a little. That night, as I walked out into the cool air, I looked up at the stars. They seemed brighter somehow, as if someone had polished them just for me. And I thought of all the choices I'd been given, to stay or to go, to forgive or to harden, to love or to close off. Every one of them had led me here, to this gentle peace, this quiet freedom. Sometimes the hardest goodbyes are just the beginning of coming home. The winter that followed was mild, but the air still carried that crisp edge that makes you want to wrap a blanket around both your shoulders and your heart. My little apartment had become something of a haven, a kettle that whistled at precisely 4 minutes, a stack of notebooks beside my chair, and a view of the river that reminded me daily that life never truly stands still. It only changes direction. Since the storytelling night at Emma's school, things had begun to bloom in quiet ways I hadn't expected. A teacher from the local library had been in the audience and asked if I would consider reading for their Voices of Maple Hill program, an evening where ordinary folks shared stories of the town's past. I hesitated at first, unsure if anyone wanted to hear the ramblings of an old woman. But Emma had clasped my hand and said, Grandma, you have to. You tell stories that sound like hugs. So I said yes. Each afternoon, I would sit by the window and write. I wrote about love that outlasts storms, about mothers who give until they're empty and then somehow keep giving anyway. I wrote about the river, about Margaret's garden, about laughter echoing through half-empty houses. And when the words didn't come easily, I just let them sit on the page like resting birds. Mark would call every Sunday evening now. The conversations weren't long, but they were steady, like the rhythm of a tide finding its way back to shore. Clara sometimes joined in, her voice lighter than I'd ever heard it. And Emma, oh, that child, she'd chatter about school projects and friends, always finishing with, I love you more than pancakes. One Sunday in early February, Mark mentioned that Clara's father had passed away. He said she'd taken it hard but was finding comfort in helping her mother sort through old belongings. You should see the letters they wrote each other, he said. I didn't know people loved like that anymore. I smiled to myself. They still do, I thought. They just forget until life reminds them. The library reading came on a Friday evening. I wore my best navy dress, the one I'd bought for Mark's graduation years ago, and pinned a small brooch near my collar. As I stood behind the lectern, the faces before me blurred at first. Old friends, curious neighbors, a few high school students sitting cross-legged near the front. Then, just as the lights dimmed, I spotted them. Mark, Clara, and Emma slipping quietly into the back row. My heart fluttered, but my hand stayed steady on the pages. I began with a story I'd titled The House That Knew My Footsteps. It wasn't word for word my own tale, but the soul of it was there. As I read, I saw heads nod, eyes glisten. And when I reached the final line, sometimes the road away is the only road home, the room fell utterly silent before the applause began, soft and real. Afterward, people came up to shake my hand, but all I could see was my family waiting near the door. Emma launched herself into my arms first. Grandma, you were the best one, she squealed. Mark hugged me next, longer than he ever had before. You're something else, Mom, he said quietly. Clara's eyes were shining. You made me cry in front of strangers, she laughed, but in a good way. Driving home that night, I thought of my husband. I imagined him sitting in the passenger seat, smiling the way he used to when I'd tell him about some small success. You did good, Evie, he would have said. Real good. Spring returned early, bringing with it that restless kind of hope that smells of rain and new beginnings. I'd kept in touch with Helen since Margaret's passing. One afternoon, she called to tell me that Margaret had left me something in her will. It's not much, Helen said, but she insisted. When I opened the small parcel a few days later, I found a key and a note in Margaret's uneven handwriting. For Evelyn Hart, the little cottage by the river should have someone who still believes in stories. Make it your own. I cried right there at my kitchen table. It wasn't about the cottage, it was the thought that even in her last days, Margaret had been thinking about where I might find peace next. The place was only 15 minutes outside town, tucked behind a grove of birch trees. It had once been a caretaker's cottage for the Dempsey farm, long unused but still sturdy. The roof sagged a little, the porch creaked like an old violin, yet as soon as I stepped inside, I felt that quiet hum again, the one that says this could be home. With help from Mark and Clara, we spent weekends cleaning, painting, and mending. Emma loved helping me plant flowers along the walkway. "Let's do marigolds," she said. "They're Grandpa's favorite color, right?" I smiled. "They are, darling." Watching my son hammer nails and laugh with his daughter as Clara carried boxes from the car, I realized that healing isn't loud. It's a series of small, steady gestures that rebuild trust, grain by grain. One morning, as I sorted through old boxes in the cottage attic, I found something unexpected: a weathered envelope tucked behind a loose beam. It was addressed in my husband's handwriting to me. My hands trembled as I opened it. The paper was yellowed, but the ink still strong. "Evie, if you ever find this, it means life carried you further than we planned, and that's all right. You were never meant to stay still. Don't let grief make you small. Go live enough for both of us. And when you sit by the river someday, think of me in the laughter of the water." Tom, I sat there for a long while, the dust motes swirling in the sunlight like tiny blessings. The letter was decades old, written just before his last trip to the hospital. I had never known it existed, but finding it now, after everything, felt like one last piece clicking into place. When I showed it to Mark later that week, he read it twice before saying, "Dad always knew how to say things straight, didn't he?" "He did," I said, "even from the other side of time." As months passed, the cottage became more than a gift. It became a gathering place. On weekends, the family would come for picnics, and sometimes Clara's mother joined, bringing her quiet grace and gentle humor. We'd sit on the porch, drinking lemonade, listening to the river. One evening, after everyone had gone, I took my notebook outside. The moon hung low and silver, the kind of light that makes everything look half-remembered. I began writing a new story, one about forgiveness, not the grand, dramatic kind, but the slow sort that lives in everyday gestures. A meal cooked with love, a phone call returned, a smile offered instead of silence. Halfway through, I heard footsteps. Mark stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. "Always." He lowered himself onto the step beside me. "I've been thinking a lot about the past year," he said. "How I handled things. I don't think I've ever told you just how sorry I am." "You don't need to," I said softly. "I know." "I do, though." He looked out at the dark water. "I thought growing up meant drawing lines. I didn't realize love doesn't need boundaries. It needs bridges." I reached for his hand. "Then let's keep building." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Deal." That summer, I started volunteering at the library, helping kids write short stories. I'd tell them, "Don't worry about getting it perfect. Just tell the truth kindly." Some afternoons, Emma would come along, perched at the end of the table with her notebook, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth as she wrote about dragons and brave grandmothers. It became our ritual. She'd write, I'd edit, and then we'd walk home together, stopping for ice cream at the corner shop. One day she asked, "Grandma, do you think stories can make people better?" I thought for a moment. "I think they remind people how to be better," I said. "Sometimes we just forget the way." She smiled, satisfied. "Then I'm going to write happy endings." I laughed. "Then you'll never run out of work." As autumn came again, the season of endings and beginnings, I stood by the river one evening, the same river that had witnessed so many of my turns in life. The air was cool, the leaves drifting down like slow applause. I took a deep breath and whispered, "Thank you." I wasn't sure if I was speaking to God, to Tom, to Margaret, or simply to life itself. Maybe all of them. The water shimmered back in reply. Inside the cottage, the kettle began to whistle. I poured a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the first stars appear. On the table beside me lay a folder with the stories I'd written, over 100 pages now. The local library had offered to publish them in a small collection titled Whispers by the River. The thought made me chuckle. Grandma's whispers, indeed. I picked up my pen, added one last note at the end of the manuscript, and wrote, "To anyone who has ever been asked to choose between staying small or walking away, take the suitcase. The world is kinder than you think." When I set the pen down, I felt that same peaceful certainty that had carried me since the day I left my son's house. Life had unfolded exactly as it needed to. The losses, the pauses, the letters never sent. They had all been part of the long conversation between me and Grace. Outside, the wind lifted through the trees, rustling the marigolds that lined the path. The porch light flickered once, as if in gentle applause. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was remembering a story. I felt like I was living one, still, quietly, beautifully, in real time. I used to think that growing old would feel like disappearing, like fading at the edges until life quietly forgot you were ever there. But it doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like becoming softer around the truth, like watching the world with gentler eyes. The summer after Whispers by the River was published, I found myself busier than I'd been in years. The library held a small launch gathering. Nothing fancy, just neighbors, friends, and a few folks curious about the lady who wrote about the marigolds. I signed a few copies, shook more hands than I could count, and smiled until my cheeks hurt. But the real joy came later, in the quiet, when letters began to arrive. Handwritten notes from strangers who'd read my stories and found themselves somewhere between the lines. One woman wrote, "Your story about leaving when love turned cold helped me pack my own suitcase, and I'm finally safe." Another said, "You made me call my mother again." I would sit by my window in the mornings, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and read each letter as if it were a prayer. And yet, beneath all that contentment, there was a small, persistent whisper, the kind that lives in the body before the mind can name it. A flutter in my chest one afternoon as I walked to the river. A faint dizziness when I stood too fast. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was the summer heat or too much excitement. Then one evening, as I was preparing supper, the room tilted. The kettle hissed, the light dimmed, and suddenly I was on the floor, breathing like I'd forgotten how. When I came to, the world was quiet except for the steady ticking of the clock. I didn't tell anyone right away. Old habits die hard. I'd spent a lifetime being the strong one, the listener, the caretaker. But when it happened again 2 mornings later, I knew it was time. Mark drove me to the hospital that afternoon, his face set in a mask of calm that couldn't quite hide the worry in his eyes. "Mom, you should have told me sooner," he said, gripping the steering wheel. "I didn't want to make a fuss," I said softly. "Fusses never helped anyone." He exhaled sharply. "You are someone, Mom." The test took most of the day. Monitors, scans, blood drawn by hands that were far too young to have seen so much fragility. The doctor, a kind-eyed woman with silver streaks in her hair, sat with me afterward. "Mrs. Hart," she began gently, "your heart's showing signs of arrhythmia. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but something we need to monitor closely." I nodded. "So, it's tired." She smiled. "A little, but still strong. We'll manage it." That night, lying in the hospital bed, I listened to the rhythmic beeping beside me and thought about all the hearts I'd known. My husband's steady one, Margaret's fading one, even Mark's, still learning how to soften. I realized then that the heart isn't just a muscle. It's a memory keeper. Every beat a small echo of every person you've ever loved. When I woke the next morning, Mark was asleep in the chair beside me, his hand still holding mine. For a moment, I just watched him. His hair flecked with gray now, his brow furrowed even in rest. My boy, the one I'd once carried on my hip and later carried in my prayers. I squeezed his hand gently and he stirred. "Hey," he murmured, rubbing his eyes. "Hey," I whispered back. "You scared me, you know." I scared myself a little, too. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't have to do everything alone anymore, Mom." I smiled faintly. "I know. I think I just forgot what it felt like to lean." He looked at me then with that same expression he used to wear when he was 5 and afraid of thunder, wanting to be brave but needing reassurance. "Promise me you'll take it easy for a while." "I'll try," I said. "But you know I've never been good at sitting still." He laughed softly. "You've earned a little stillness." The weeks that followed were slow, tender ones. The doctor prescribed medication and gentle exercise, and Clara insisted on cooking meals for me. Emma decorated my cottage with paper hearts and drawings that said things like, "Grandma's heart is the strongest heart." One afternoon, Clara sat with me on the porch while I rested. She looked out at the river and said, "When I first met you, I was so intimidated. You had this quiet strength that made me feel small. I think I spent years trying to measure up." I reached for her hand. "Oh, Clara, strength isn't about being unshakable. It's about shaking and still choosing to stay standing." She smiled, tears welling. "You taught me that, and I didn't even know I was learning." Sometimes wisdom sneaks in through the back door, I suppose. One evening, as the sun was setting, I took out an old box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were photographs, keepsakes, and a folded piece of paper I didn't recognize. It was a letter, written in my husband's familiar handwriting, but this one addressed not to me, but to Mark. My breath caught. The envelope was unsealed, yellowed with age. I hesitated, then unfolded it. "My boy," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you're older than I ever got to be. I hope you're kind to your mother. She's stronger than anyone you'll ever meet, but don't let that make you forget she's human, too. Take care of her when I can't. Learn to forgive fast. It'll save you a lifetime of ache. And when you become a father, love like she did, with both hands open." I pressed the letter to my chest and closed my eyes. I imagined giving it to Mark, imagined his face softening as he read it. But something in me said not yet. Some things are meant to be found in their own time. That night I dreamed of Tom. He was standing by the river, young again, smiling. He didn't speak, but I felt his message just the same. "You did good, Evie. You kept your promise." When I woke, the world felt sharper, more vivid, like someone had turned the colors up. A few months later, I had a small scare again, another fainting spell while watering the garden. This time I didn't panic. Mark came rushing over, but I was already sitting up on the porch steps, breathing slowly. "Mom, we're calling an ambulance," he said, his voice trembling. I shook my head gently. "It's all right, I'm all right." He knelt beside me, tears brimming. "Please don't say that like it's okay to leave." I reached for his face, cupped it in my hand. "Sweetheart, leaving isn't the end. It's just the next chapter. But I'm not going anywhere yet." He laughed through his tears. "You always have to get the last word, don't you?" "Someone's got to keep you humble," I teased. After he left that evening, I sat on the porch for a long time, listening to the crickets. My body felt fragile, yes, but my spirit felt vast. It's strange how illness can shrink your world and expand your heart all at once. I began writing again, not stories this time, but letters. One to Mark, one to Clara, one to Emma, sealed for when she turned 18. I told them everything I'd learned too late, that love is louder than regret, that forgiveness is a choice you make every morning, that endings are only gentle doors into the unknown. When autumn came, the marigolds bloomed brighter than ever, as if trying to prove something to the fading sun. I'd sit among them each afternoon, wrapped in a shawl, notebook on my lap. The local newspaper asked to feature my book, and the reporter, a young woman with earnest eyes, asked me during the interview, "Mrs. Hart, what's the secret to a life well lived?" I smiled, thinking of every heartbreak, every meal shared, every goodbye that had taught me how to love more fiercely. "The secret," I said slowly, "is to say thank you for everything, even the things that break you." She nodded, jotting it down. "That's beautiful," I chuckled. "It's true." One crisp October morning, I woke before dawn and walked to the river. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the world still half asleep. My heart felt steady, strong in its own tender rhythm. I thought about fear and how it had followed me my whole life. Fear of not being enough, of losing love, of being left behind. And yet here I was, still breathing, still finding beauty in the morning light. I whispered into the air, "I'm not afraid anymore." And for the first time, I knew it was true. Later that week, Mark and Clara threw a small family dinner for my birthday. Nothing fancy, just laughter, candles, and Emma insisting on baking the cake herself, which turned out beautifully lopsided. As we sat around the table, I looked at each of them and felt something deeper than joy. It was peace. "Speech," Emma cried, banging her fork against her cup. I laughed. "Oh, sweetheart, I've said enough speeches for one lifetime." But they waited, smiling, so I raised my glass of lemonade and said, "Here's to growing, to forgiving, and to never letting fear tell us when to stop dancing." Clara clapped first, then Mark. And when I caught his eye, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, that boyish glimmer of pure love. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat by the window and wrote one last line in my notebook. Every ending is just a softer way of saying thank you. The year slipped into its last stretch, that golden edge between autumn and winter, when the air feels both tired and holy. From my cottage window, I could see the birch trees thinning, their leaves floating down like old secrets. The river ran slower now, whispering instead of singing. I had begun to move slower, too. Most mornings I woke before the sun, brewed my tea, and sat with the notebook I kept beside the window. I never knew if I was writing a story, a prayer, or a memory. The words came as they wished, soft as the fog on the water. I'd taken to calling them little goodbyes, not to anyone in particular, just to the moments that had passed without asking permission. The steam from my cup, the first bird calling, the smell of Clara's cinnamon rolls on Sunday afternoons when the family visited. When Emma bounded through the door these days, she was taller, her hair a wild halo of sunlight. She'd fling her backpack onto the couch and shout, "Grandma, guess what I wrote today?" Every time I'd pretend to be shocked. "Another story? You'll put me out of business, child." She'd grin, eyes bright. "Not a chance. You're my favorite author." Sometimes she'd read aloud while I listened, her voice stumbling in places, her imagination too big for her punctuation. The stories were always brave, girls who built boats out of starlight, dragons that guarded gardens instead of gold. When she finished, she'd ask, "Do you think they're good enough?" I'd smile and touch her cheek. "They already are." As December approached, Mark and Clara suggested I stay with them through the holidays. I promised I would after I finished one more chapter. They knew better than to rush me. One evening, while the sky deepened to blue, I opened my husband's old pocket watch. It had long since stopped, but I liked to hold it anyway, feeling its small weight in my palm. The hands pointed to 8:17. No matter the hour, always 8:17. I found comfort in its stubbornness. I began a new story that night, one about a woman who'd spent her life listening. To rivers, to people, to the quiet inside her own chest. She learns in the end that the world keeps whispering even after you stop answering aloud. I didn't name her, though I think anyone reading would know who she was. Outside, a wind picked up. The trees knocked gently against the siding, like old friends asking to come in. I wrote until my eyes blurred, until the lines on the page looked like ripples in water. Then I set down my pen and simply listened. To the wind, the ticking clock, the heartbeat that still answered in its uneven rhythm. Christmas came wrapped in laughter and snow. The cottage smelled of pine and vanilla. Mark carried in the tree, grumbling about its crookedness, while Clara hummed along with the radio. Emma insisted on placing the star at the top herself. When the lights were finally lit, their glow filled every corner, warm and patient. I sat back in my chair, a quilt over my knees, and watched my family. This patchwork I'd once thought torn beyond repair. "Grandma, it's perfect," Emma said, stepping back to admire the tree. "It is," I whispered. Later, after gifts and cocoa and the easy hush that follows joy, I handed Mark a small wrapped package. "For you," I said. He opened it carefully. Inside was his father's letter, the one I'd found months before. His breath caught as he unfolded the paper. The room fell still while he read. When he looked up, his eyes were shining. "Mom, I don't know what to say." "Then don't," I said. "Just keep it safe." He leaned down and kissed my forehead. "Thank you." It was enough. After they left that night, the cottage felt tenderly quiet. I tidied the cups, banked the fire, and stood for a moment in the doorway watching snow drift across the porch. The world seemed suspended, holding its breath. I went to my writing desk and opened my notebook to a fresh page. For once, I didn't write a story or a letter. I simply wrote a single line. When love has done all it can, it becomes light. Then I closed the notebook, placed it beside the pocket watch, and turned off the lamp. The next morning was bright and impossibly still. Mark stopped by early with muffins, knocking twice before letting himself in. "Mom?" he called softly. The kettle sat ready on the stove. The window cracked open to the river's murmur. On the desk lay my notebook, a cup of tea still faintly warm. He found me in my chair by the window, wrapped in the quilt, eyes closed, face turned toward the sunlight. For a moment, he just stood there listening to the river, the wind, the gentle rhythm of the house. Then he smiled. "Hey, Mom," he whispered. Morning. He didn't rush toward me, not right away. Instead, he reached for the notebook and read the last line I had written. His hand trembled, but his heart steadied. He placed the notebook back on the desk and sat beside me, watching the light spill across the marigolds that had somehow bloomed again despite the frost. Maybe I was sleeping. Maybe I'd simply followed the light a little further than usual. Either way, there was no fear in that room, only gratitude. Weeks later, the library held a small gathering in the cottage garden. They called it an afternoon of whispers. People came with stories of their own. Neighbors, friends, even strangers who'd written to me once upon a time. Mark read one of my pieces aloud, his voice steady. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay soft. Emma stood beside him, clutching her own little notebook. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the small podium, chin high. "This is called The Woman by the River," she said. "It's about someone who listened to everything and everyone until the world finally listened back." When she finished, the crowd was quiet for a long time, and then the applause rose, slow and full. Clara slipped her arm through Mark's. "She's just like her grandmother," she whispered. He smiled. "Yeah," he said, "exactly like her." That evening, after everyone had gone, the river shimmered under the setting sun. A light breeze stirred the marigolds, carrying their scent up toward the hills. In the cottage window, the lamp flickered once, though no one was inside to light it. And if you were standing there on the path, you might have sworn you heard a woman's voice, soft as a breath, saying, "Thank you." Then the wind would have taken the word and folded it into the water, where it would travel on, just another whisper by the river.